This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, Lawrence Krauss. He is an American-Canadian theoretical physicist and cosmologist who is the foundation professor of the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. He's also the director of its Origins project. Lawrence has had a long and interesting career, ups and downs all around, but a very bright guy with some extremely interesting books. For example, The Physics of Star Trek, A Universe from Nothing, and the greatest story ever told so far, Why Are We Here? Beyond my podcast today, if you're interested in a little bit more about Lawrence and his beliefs, go on over to YouTube. You will find a long history of him giving really interesting presentations. And one quick reminder before we get into my guest today, if you like this podcast, head on over to iTunes. I would appreciate a review. Let me know what you think. I want to hear it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's go ahead and jump right into my guest today, Lawrence Krauss. I think about you. I go through your career, all the cool topics you've been in the middle of, all the cool insights you've pulled out. We can only just touch on things in this conversation. We're going to send a lot of people to Amazon to buy books for sure. But I'd love to take you back in time to a very young man for you. When was the first moment you can really imagine that you were a skeptic? When did it hit you that you knew, hold on, whether it's just instinct or gut, you just said, hold on, what they're telling me, what the adults are telling me is not right?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I think part of my upbringing was I was encouraged to think for myself. And just being an observer of the world, it was clear that the reason people did things was often not only not reasonable, but not the reason they were saying. I think that was one thing, just observing, and the fact that I was encouraged to think for myself from a very young age was probably useful. But I think with religion, for example, it was a matter of, I was brought up in a Jewish household, and remember we did the high holidays and did those things you do on the high holidays and recite the histories and stories. It just became clearer and clearer. And I wanted to believe that stuff. It's really a lot of fun, and it's nice to believe that stuff. But as I got older, it was just like Santa Claus. I mean, it was just like, okay, but it's obvious that this is a fairy tale. I became skeptical of the reality of those things, not by any revelation, but just as I just grew out of them. And I think also I was strongly influenced by reading Albert Camus when I was in high school. And I think existentialism became very important to me. And The Stranger, or L'Étranger, I read it in French, was an important book because it was a book about a man who was sentenced to death because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral. And it was clear to me that the reasons that people act are often misplaced, and one has to be careful to not fall for either peer pressure or what people are quoting as what's right and what's appropriate. You have to think for yourself. Also, for me, when I was growing up, I went through one stage where I, for whatever reason, in grade 6, I suddenly did very poorly in school. I moved to another location. In grade 7, I got the highest grades in the school, and I suddenly realized I was exactly the same person. I hadn't changed at all, but people treated me incredibly differently. And therefore, I became very skeptical of people's perceptions of me. And I think that helped me become more skeptical of my own perceptions of reality.
You make an interesting point there, and I relate to it, the emotional part, and I assume that must be some part of your personality to where when you were in that first environment, maybe you weren't treated so great. You go to a more supportive environment, and all of a sudden your performance jumps.
Yeah, it's hard to know with chicken and egg. You're right, and I'm not going to pretend to have analyzed it in great detail, but it's self-fulfilling prophecies in some sense. People expected me to do badly at one point, and people, because they didn't have any expectations when I didn't do badly, suddenly had expectations for me to do very well in the second place. And I realized that it was just that. It was people's expectations, and neither of them were grounded in necessarily in a reality. And I decided early on that if I was going to do things, it was for myself. And I would try not to rely on the perceptions of others, but I would also try and be skeptical of my own perceptions of myself. And that's the hardest part of skepticism. And I think that comes with science. Having done science, where Richard Feynman says the easiest person to fool is yourself. And often doing science, you come up with something you think is great. And it's really easy to just let it go. And then you better say, well, maybe it's wrong. Let me check and see. And half the time it is, or maybe more than half the time.
You stole my thunder. My next question on kind of your personal origins was to go into one of your biggest influences and was to go into Richard Feynman. We can only talk so much about him and all the things you learned, but I would love for you to maybe give a big picture, a jumping off point. I was watching just the other day his great computer heuristics lecture on YouTube. Fantastic. Can you give a perspective from being up close and personal to the audience, to his brilliance? I mean, people can go watch his videos, they can read his writings, but is there a perspective that you would like to offer?
Well, I mean, as you know, I wrote a whole book about Feynman. First of all, he was incredibly charismatic. But what was clear was that he wasn't afraid of asking questions. He had, to first approximation, and this was one of his weaknesses as well, he didn't rely on anyone else. He derived everything he knew himself. And therefore, he knew, and when you've done that, when you've derived all of physics on your own, in some sense, you have a facility at almost every level that's almost unfathomable. When you haven't relied on other people's regurgitations, but when you've re-derived everything for yourself, and Feynman was able to do that because he was Feynman, it gave him a kind of incredible power and an intuition that was eerie at times. But I think when I first got to know him, and it was probably more the charisma and the clear intelligence that came through his eyes and the excitement he had about everything that I found seductive and compelling, that I wanted to emulate.
I can see in a personality like that. I've had a lot of people on this show, brilliant mathematicians, very smart guys. But a guy like Feynman, you watch him, and even from a distance, from afar, just watching the YouTube videos, the charisma, you say to yourself, hold on, this guy not only had the people skills, he had the math, he had the science. It's an amazing combination.
Well, it was an amazing combination. That's the point. I mean, it was not just a brilliant scientist, but he was a very charismatic man. And the two things come together. But as I tried to point out, I mean, I wrote a scientific biography of Richard Feynman because he was very charismatic, but that charisma wouldn't have mattered if he hadn't been also a remarkable scientist. And that's the reason he would want to be remembered, in spite of the fact that he loved telling stories about himself, is the science that he did. And it's really remarkable how he made breakthroughs in so many different areas. Of course, he would have done more if he'd had more trust in other people. As a former friend of mine, who was probably the smartest physicist at Harvard when I was there, Sidney Coleman, he's deceased now. He once said to Feynman, the problem, what Feynman didn't realize is that not everyone else was a schmuck. That you can actually learn things from other people, and you don't have to reproduce it all yourself. And I think Feynman could have done more if he'd been, in some sense, more willing to rely on others instead of himself. But of course, his greatest strength was being able to rely on himself. So it's a double-edged sword. But his enthusiasm and his excitement and the way he explained things, I mean, all of that is stuff that I took away from and in some sense tried to emulate in my own work and in my own explanations and the only way I deal with people. He once told me to always seek out adventures, and I guess I have. And I think so. Science is an adventure and life is an adventure.
It's fantastic wisdom. I wonder sometimes how I got to live in Asia, and it's just a big adventure. That's how life goes. Let's dive into some of your work, which is really cool stuff. And I want to start with something that's really not controversial at all, which is your belief that a belief in God is irrational. That's not controversial at all.
Well, first of all, I don't use the word belief. Let's make that quite clear. I try never to use the word believe. It's not an appropriate word for science. Things are either likely or unlikely, but believing doesn't really mean anything.
Let me restate that then. Science refutes God.
Well, look, what science does is not even just necessarily refute God. It makes God irrelevant. I've been a scientist for 40 years, and I've never heard the word God mentioned in a scientific meeting. I mean, because we try and understand the way the world works, and God doesn't come into it. It's just a matter of there's no evidence for God, but there's no necessity for God. It's not as if science refutes God or science opposes God. Science just gets by and explains the world, and God is irrelevant. So I rather think of myself as an apatheist rather than a theist, namely, God is just irrelevant. The fact that there's no evidence for God, and certainly that all the world's religions disagree in their detailed doctrines with what we know to be true about the world. So there's no doubt that the God of the world's religions, as stated in their holy books, disagrees with the evidence of reality, but even a more obtuse God, a more deistic God, some intelligence that doesn't disagree directly with anything we measure, it's irrelevant.
I understand people's desire, the need to know, right? I get that. But what I don't get is very smart people inventing something. And I'm not even trying to give a view here. I'm just kind of like playing devil's advocate.
The point is that reason is the slave of passion, and we all invent things. We all invent 10 reasons to go to work in the morning. And after all, religion was a way of trying to explain the world before we understood how the world really worked. And I think that people need to get through the day. And the point is that people are very good at believing two mutually inconsistent things at the same time. So there's certainly deeply religious scientists who at the same time don't let their religious beliefs get in the way of their science. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, offensive people. I mean, there's scientists who are Republican too, and so there's no accounting for taste.
Let's dive into something which is a really interesting statement. Some people might take it as provocative, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but you said, forget Jesus. The stars died for us to be here today. Look, until I dive into your world, that's not something I hear. It's a fascinating statement, and most people probably don't even have a context for what it even means. The floor is yours.
Well, look, what is amazing, and it was one of the reasons I wrote my book, Universe or Nothing, but it's one of the most poetic things I know about the universe. One of the reasons I write about science is to share these amazing things we've discovered. I find it so tragic that we're living this time with the most amazing ideas humans have ever come up with, and most people aren't aware of them. The fact that every atom in our bodies came from a star that exploded, and they're maybe, as I've said, the atoms in your left hand from different stars in your right hand, they've experienced the most intense cosmic fireworks in existence. All your atoms have gone through maybe 1, 2, 5 stars that have exploded in supernova explosions in order to get to you, because the elements that make up your body, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, they weren't created in the Big Bang. They were created in the fiery cores of stars, and the only way they could get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So that poetic way I tried to present it is it reflects what I think is just amazing, that we are star children, that we are stardust. We are intimately connected to the cosmos. I find it amazing to think that what my atoms have gone through, and I wrote a whole book called Atom, which was the story of an oxygen atom from the beginning of the universe to the end, because I find the story so amazing.
You make the point, and it is tough in this day and age where everybody is doing something and less time to pause. But when a guy like you dives into a subject, figures something out, and then can translate it back to us, these topics are just amazing because we literally we're not exposed to it in this way growing up. At least maybe those that are studying are exposed, but it really is a kind of a hole in our human understanding right now that we are not taking the time to find out what modern science is able to teach us.
Well, yeah, and you don't have to become an expert. Culturally, these ideas are so remarkable that we should not consider ourselves literate without even unless we have some basic understanding of what's going on, of the wonders that science has brought over the last century. Just like we wouldn't consider ourselves literate if we didn't know about World War II or the Civil War, or you wouldn't be consider yourself literate in a way if you didn't know who Shakespeare was, or from my point of view, if you didn't know who Bruce Springsteen was.
I've seen some debates with you where there'll be kind of like one side is you, maybe in a partner, and the other side is Dinesh D'Souza and a partner, and debating the existence of God, the start of the origins, etc. Talk to me through that, though. Do you find when you debate religious people, do they deny the Big Bang?
You can't classify religious people any more than you can classify, in some sense, scientists. There's a wide spectrum of people. There's some people who deny the Big Bang. There's some people like Mike Pence who thinks the world is 6,000 years old and also denies the Big Bang. There are people who use their religion as a shield to stop them from learning about the world. But there are lots of people who have deep religious feelings who don't deny the existence of the Big Bang or the fact that evolution happened. There's a wide spectrum. The problem is that for many people, they feel that things like evolution or the Big Bang are inconsistent with their belief in God. And since they believe in God, they can't believe in those things. And the point is, those things are true whether or not you believe in them. But I think it's unfair to classify all religious people under one umbrella any more than it is to classify anyone else. Some of the people I debate, very rarely will I debate anyone who's, in fact, I don't think I've ever really, I'm trying to remember if I've ever really debated a young earth creationist. The people that I debate are much more subtle in their efforts to try and convince people that what they're thinking is reasonable. And I think they lose much of the audience that would come to a debate with me if they said the earth is 6,000 years old.
That seems really tough. I'm a guy that has proudly found a whale vertebra that's got to be some untold millions of years old. And when you hold that in your hands, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist, but the 6,000 thing doesn't work.
Well, look, I was just in the Grand Canyon 4 days ago. I was driving past it, and you just can't look at that. And I mean, look, as I said, if you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, don't get in a car, don't use an oven, don't use your television, because all of the same laws of physics, chemistry, and to some extent biology, but physics and chemistry anyway, that govern those things tells us the Earth is more than 6,000 years old. So you're a hypocrite if you use those things and you also think the Earth is 6,000 years old. You're either a hypocrite or ignorant, and I guess a combination too.
Let me walk you through, though, and I'm going to dive back more into the origins and the start from your perspective and things you can teach us. But science, I want you to kind of describe science from your perspective. It's not a thing, it's a process. And I love people that talk about processes because this is where to go. This is the way to really be successful in achieving anything, is to think about a good process. Why don't you explain your perspective?
That's of vital importance. The fact that science is a process, it's not a collection of facts. That's part of the problem, the way we teach. That's why we have fake news and stuff, or at least people think there are, because they think that science is just a collection of flat facts. Then you can choose to believe those facts or not. Science is a process that helps us how to distinguish facts from nonsense. And it's a process that's worked incredibly effectively, taking us in 400 years from what was at the end of the Middle Ages to today. And it's a process that works. If it didn't work, we'd give it up. And it's a wonderful process. And so what we need to do in schools is not teach the facts aren't important. As I say, I have more facts on my iPhone than you can learn in school. I have more falsehoods than you can learn in school too. What we need to teach kids is the way to tell the difference between what's sensible and what's nonsense. And that's what science gives us tools to do.
My father grew up Catholic. I grew up Catholic too. I would say today I've got a very different view. But whenever I have this conversation with my father, who's a doctor, he's a very rational, reasonable guy. He doesn't deny any of the science or anything like that, doesn't deny evolution and nothing like that. But he takes it to the very beginning, which is, I think, something where you like to go. He doesn't have an answer, but he just says, well, gosh, what the hell happened at the start? How did it all just start? Didn't there have to be somebody there to pull the trigger?
Well, no, I mean, that seems sensible. But the point is that what science teaches us is that what we think is our intuition is suspect. Science teaches us that what we may think is normal or reasonable may not be reasonable. We have to learn to get around that. And so, sure, it seems to me that it seems quite reasonable for people to think if there was a creation, someone had to create it. But in fact, that's not necessary. You can have a whole universe come into existence without any supernatural shenanigans, a universe that eventually will contain 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, from nothing, without any supernatural shenanigans. It can all be a cosmic accident. Just like snowflakes come into existence just by the laws of physics and chemistry and the polar molecule that is water. And these incredibly beautiful patterns are created, but no one is painting or drawing or putting together those individual snowflakes when they come down. And the universe can be incredibly fascinating and seem complicated, but you don't need an intelligence to do it.
To understand a universe from nothing, and you talk about many things that can help us to understand that, dark energy, for example, but really requires us to just acknowledge our limitations and what it's possible for us to understand.
Of course. I mean, and then, you said earlier, people really want to know things or something. I think you said that. And the point is that that's something that Feynman said in science. The great thing is not knowing and being comfortable with not knowing, not feeling you have to know. But the quest, not understanding, is a wonderful thing because it means that you have a quest that you may understand things. And also, not understanding something is not evidence for God, as I've often said. It's evidence for not understanding something. This notion that you feel you have to know and again, parents are often that way. They don't want to tell their kids when they ask them questions. They don't want to say, I don't know. Teachers often do. But we should all be proud of saying that and say, I don't know, let's see if we can find out. Because then it becomes a process of discovery and adventure. The same process I've been privileged in my life to be paid to do as a scientist. Having a universe that's mysterious and in which there's many things we don't understand is wonderful.
When you have debates, for example, you debating Dinesh D'Souza, Dinesh could end up at some point in time, maybe we find out everything he's saying is correct.
With Dinesh, that would be impossible.
Okay, but hold on. What I was going to say is that we could find out everything he's saying could be correct, but he doesn't have evidence for it. And that's the part that drives me crazy, is like back to the inventing things. If you don't have the evidence for it, why say it's this? Whereas you're saying, look, I don't know everything, but let's be skeptical. Let's acknowledge what we do know, but let's don't say we know something when we don't know it.
Exactly. Feynman said that. I'd rather not know something than know something that's wrong. I think, again, it's a character trait.
As we think about the universe, I think about math. Is it possible that everything that you've studied in your life is a simulation?
Well, it's possible, but there's no evidence of it. And moreover, it seems to me to be highly unlikely. First of all, simulations generally, if you look at simulations on a screen, they're often pixels that go bad. And, generally there are not in real life pixels that go bad, except maybe inside the head of Donald Trump. But also, what evidence is there that we are a simulation? And once again, when people say that, the key question they beg is they say, well, then what about the beings that created the simulation? Are they a simulation in another simulation? I mean, why would we have to be a simulation? Obviously, something more complex than us would have to have made the simulation.
And you like the idea that based on our understanding right now, that we do have kind of a start. Let me ask you, can you see through your work, can you imagine an end?
Oh, well, I've written a lot about the end of the universe. It turns out it'll likely end badly. But it looks like the universe will more likely end up ending with a whimper than a bang. The universe is just going to get cold, dark, and empty, and all the galaxies we now see will disappear. And in trillions of years, the universe will become cold, dark, and empty. And that's likely the future. And what I love about it is it's likely the future, because we can't say for certain that it is. Based on what we know now, the most likely future is a cold, dark, empty universe. And so enjoy it while you can.
As the universe is expanding and pulling apart, I've seen you make the statement, and I might have said that wrong there, you can correct me, but in the future, you imagine this future, we get to it billions of years into the future, we won't have the ability, because things have changed so much, that we could just end up kind of lonely, ignorant, and dominant, but we would really not know how things unfolded because everything will have stretched so far away.
Exactly, I've written about that, is that it turns out because the universe is expanding faster and faster, the galaxies that we now see will eventually be moving away from us faster than the speed of light. And scientists in the far future will evolve on a planet around a star, which will still exist in the far future. Stars like our sun will still be around then. We'll look around and not see any galaxies other than our own and see no evidence for the expanding universe. So we are living at a fortunate time in some sense to be able to detect those things.
I'd love to throw some names by you, because I know they're people that you've had a chance to work with, collaborate, debate. You've got some great insights. We've talked about Richard Feynman. What would you share with the audience about Richard Dawkins? What has been your big takeaway about Richard Dawkins?
Well, I think people think of Richard Dawkins as kind of mean-spirited person, and he's not. He's a very gentle, good-natured person who actually cares about what people think about him, believe it or not. So I think the thing I would say about Richard that's surprising for many people is that he's generally considerate and caring and not mean-spirited. He also is unique in the sense of the people I know that he just doesn't understand irrationality.
It's a non-starter.
Yeah. And partly comes from being sequestered in life in Oxford for your whole life, which I think is probably not a good thing. In fact, actually, I was quite honored that they asked me to consider replacing Richard when he stepped down as the Simonian chair at Oxford. And I strongly considered it for a while, but I just found I didn't want to live in Oxford all the year long. I think living there is sort of a cocoon that shields you from much of the rest of the world. So I think Richard is in some sense a product of that. But also his personal characteristic. He thinks rationally, he tries to think rationally, and he doesn't understand that. Well, he understands in a cerebral sense, but intuitively, it's hard for him to comprehend that people can be so irrational.
Okay, one of my favorites, I actually sat next to him on the Acela train from D.C. to New York, but I was too young and too nervous to just say hello or something. This would be Christopher Hitchens, one of my favorites. What was your big takeaway from Christopher?
I've said this before at his memorial service, but Christopher just made me want to grow up and be an intellectual. I mean, Christopher was one of those widely read people that I've ever known. I mean, I have a lot of books, but Christopher's house was, you'd go into his house and then books from floor to ceiling, and every one had been read. You knew it. And he had it on the tip of his tongue, those things. But the other thing about Christopher that I think most people don't realize is how tolerant he was. again, they think of him as intolerant because they see him in his debates, but he was more tolerant of people with different ideas and characters than almost anyone I know. He'd have Justice Scalia over to dinner, and someone I would have a hard time doing that with. Christopher was very, very much enjoyed being people for people's sake, even if they disagreed with him. And I think people don't realize that about him.
When he got started, his passion, it's like I just would have not wanted to be on the other side of the debate. When Christopher Hitchens was passionate and was ready to roll, you're just not going to win that one.
Well, I think that's true. He's so eloquent just because he sounds so good, too. But I've debated with him because we didn't agree on Iraq, for example, but they were always enjoyable. They were enjoyable sparring sessions. And that's what it should be. It should be intellectual discussion at its best.
I've got two more names, one you'll probably like and one you won't. For this next one, it would also be a good opportunity to kind of give your perspective on philosophy on one side and science on the other. I really enjoy his work, and that'd be Dan Dennett.
Dan is a jovial fellow. What I like about Dan is philosophy isn't for him an abstract thing. He works in an area which is sort of neuroscience and cognition, which is an area where philosophy can play a role because the questions are not yet well defined. We understand so little about consciousness that philosophy and framing questions well can have an impact. And so that, unlike physics, which is very well defined and philosophical questions don't really guide the field, in the area of consciousness studies and cognition, they do. And what Dan does is try and base his thinking on the evidence of science. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful mix of critical thinking and empirical study.
So my last name, I've already brought him up, and we might go to another name if you don't like this one, but I'd be curious your perspective on Dinesh D'Souza, and even more so, the conservative that you would debate where you walk away feeling that sense of like, okay, I appreciate how that guy got to his positions. I like his perspective. I respect him. Speak to either the one that I've not named or speak to Dinesh.
Actually, on a personal level, Dinesh is a very sweet fellow when you interact with him. Let me just say that. I've done it several times. I believe he's a con artist, and I think he just knows what side his bread is buttered on. And so I don't respect his views on almost anything. But as an individual, he's a very pleasant fellow, and I've had dinner with him twice. In the old days, there were conservatives. It doesn't seem to me that I can find. It's easier to find them anymore because who are not ideological. But there were people who were deeply intelligent and conservative.
Like a guy like Bill Buckley.
Yeah, maybe Bill Buckley is another example who you could have an intellectual conversation with. And even Christopher Hitchens would have what some people would think of as conservative views about the Clintons or Iraq. They would not mesh with the standard liberal ideology, but they were thoughtful and informed. I thought he was wrong, but nevertheless, you could have an intelligent conversation and you could learn something from them. And that's what we really should be trying to do more of, is learn from our discussions with other people. That's why I'm very concerned about what's happening on university campuses in terms of free speech. This notion that people are drowning out people because they have these ideological notions, namely the students. It's the worst thing. I've often said every student at one point in their life should have some idea and some notion they cherish and hold incredibly dear to them prove to be wrong, because that's what education is all about. But instead, people want to live in these safe zones where they're not challenged, and words that upset them are not allowed to be used. When in fact, one of the things I've said is that one of the goals of science is to make us uncomfortable, because if we're never uncomfortable, we're never going beyond our comfort zone. If we're never going beyond our comfort zone, we're never learning.
I agree with you 100%. One final question, Lawrence, kind of a fun one. At that point in time in the future, which I hope it happens, where alien life is discovered, will we find it or will it find us?
Of course, I don't make predictions about the future unless it's 2 trillion years in the future. First of all, look, I'm utterly convinced there's life elsewhere in the universe, intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. I find it hard to imagine there isn't, given the number of stars, the number of solar systems, and the number of galaxies, and the fact that all the elements that seemed necessary for life on Earth, all the components for sunlight, organic materials, and water that seem necessary for life to evolve on Earth exist ubiquitously in the universe. So I find it hard to imagine there isn't life everywhere, and even intelligent life, as I expect is rather rare, exists in the galaxy and the universe. But the galaxy and universe are big places. So I also think it's incredibly possible, indeed plausible, that intelligent life exists or will exist or has existed elsewhere in the universe, and we will simply never know about it. Look, I think one thing that is true is that if we are going to learn about intelligent elsewhere, or intelligent life is going to learn about us, which I find more implausible, I guess, because we've only been emitting signals of our existence for 100 years or so by TV and radio. We're not going to be traveling through the galaxy with starships. That's just not going to happen. The way it's going to happen is by looking for signals, electromagnetic signals or other signals of intelligence. That's the way it's going to happen. But we're not going to be we're not being visited by aliens, and we are not going to be zooming throughout the galaxy in some Star Trek future with spacecraft. And that's just not an efficient or even a plausible way of learning about it. It's so much more efficient, easier, and plausible and energetically possible to listen with our big antennas or send out radio signals than it would be to travel with a spacecraft.
I'm disappointed that you're telling me right off the bat we're never going to get the spacecraft to go.
I wrote a book called The Physics of Star Trek, and I just said that. We're not going to be zooming throughout the galaxy in starships that are powered by some new kind of fuel. It's just not going to happen. We may, of course, leave our solar system and travel and send some objects outside of our solar system. We already have the Voyager spacecraft, but we may do it more efficiently. I'm involved in a program called Breakthrough Starship, which was trying to design a very small starship, 1 gram, that we could propel at 20% the speed of light outside of our solar system to get to the nearest star in 20 years. That kind of thing may happen, but we're not going to be sending spacecraft carrying people throughout the galaxy. That just energetically is virtually impossible. We'll listen, ET will call home and we'll intercept the signal.
Lawrence, I have to tell you, as a guy who's authored 5 books myself, and I don't know how many you've authored, but the content and directions you've gone have been a touch more complicated. But it's quite fun to ask a question of someone, and you're not being cocky about it. You're like, oh yeah, I read a book on that. And look, you're telling people like, look, you really want to go down the Lawrence Krauss rabbit hole, it's time to head over to Amazon. Is there a website you want to send people to, or is it just Amazon and check out a book?
There's lawrencemkrauss.com, and you can learn what I'm doing and see things there. But people can find me and what I'm doing. It doesn't seem hard. And some people follow me on Twitter and things. I don't need to advertise or sell my books here. People can find them if they want.
I know you weren't advertising. I know you were just kind of like saying, hey, Mike, it's a question, but guess what? The answer is going to go on for a long time.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I get to the point when I've written a lot of books like I have, it's hard to not to say, well, that's in one of my books.
Hey, I appreciate you taking the time, Lawrence. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. It's a pleasure. You take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.